and welcome to my new series where I will be going through each creature that I've created in the forest so far. The creatures are where my world building journey began, so I figured it was only right that my channel started with them. It's only natural to start at the beginning. In these videos, I'll be introducing you to the creatures one by one, and I'll be trying to explain the thought process behind them. Although a lot of the time there was no thought process. They just kind of happened. So this will be an interesting series to see how chaotic my thought process can be. Should be fun at least. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce everyone to Bert. He was the creature that started it all, so I thought it was only right that he kicked off this series. What I really like about my sketchbook is you can see a ghost of the coffee stain that I used to create the creature on the opposite page. To create a pattern to follow, I found that closing the book while it was still wet and allowing it to dry slightly really helped to create these interesting shapes that could be the building blocks for my sketches. For Bert, you can see the triangular shape that I used for his head, as well as the oval shape that eventually became part of his back leg. With how close these shapes were, I knew that the creature was going to be this kind of hunch over figure, and the idea of this leg was making me lean more towards a dog-like creature. I think that's where his huge paws came from. As I was drawing him, it was making me think of amphibians. I could not say why. Maybe it was the triangular head. Maybe it was just those were the vibes that I was getting. I've said before, my creating process is a little chaotic, and I think this is the most unhinged bit. I never have a plan when I approach these coffee stains. It's all based on how I am feeling and where my imagination takes me. Once they're sketched out, then I begin working on building the backstory and somehow shoehorning it into the rest of the forest. So you would think that Bert here was an easy drawing because the forest was wide open, he was the first creature. But the forest didn't exist yet. I didn't know that that's what this would become. He was simply a drawing exercise to try and get me using my new materials. So there was little to no reasoning behind his anatomy, and this gave him an odd appearance of these lizard-like features with mammal-like paws. So I had to build a story that combined these features in a way that made logical sense. Creatures in this sketchbook have a backstory, and Bert is no exception, even if he was the first creature. Most of the time I decided on the creatures' backstories as I was colouring them, but for Bert it was a little bit different. I'd started thinking about his backstory and why he might look like this, but it wasn't until afterwards and when I started to draw more creatures that his backstory really fleshed out. For Bert, I imagine him as an odd amalgamation of creatures that really only made sense if he was a mimic or a shapeshifter. Then he would be able to take on the features of the creatures around him, and that would explain his odd amphibian body with his mammal-like paws. As I was noodling around with his story, I was contemplating why he might have such a strange assortment of features. As a shapeshifter, you would assume that he could fully morph into the creatures he was trying to imitate, and it took me a while to realise why Bert might have an issue with his abilities, and it kind of came down to the practical aspects of his skill. While a lot of shape-shifting stories has it as this innate skill that doesn't take much effort and the characters just seem to be able to do it, my thinking is that any life skill must be taught. You don't magically speak when you're born or walk. You have to learn them gradually over time. I decided that the same is true for shifting. It has its own rules and nuances that can only be taught. For instance, Bert has discovered that he cannot create mass from nothing, and vice versa, so he is limited in his transformations to beings of similar sizes. This is why he has so much mass. It might be a small animal, but he is beefy. He has a lot of muscle on him to give him more mass, to give him more opportunities to transform. If he had grown up around other shifters, he should have known this. He would have been taught how to harness his skill and his limitations. And this is where the story gets a little dark. He must have not grown up with those of his own kind, so it stands to reason he did not grow up with parents. My imagination apparently decided that the first creature in the forest had to have a tragic backstory. Not sure what that says about me. Anyway, I've not actually decided what happened to his parents yet. I quite like to think that it's a mystery that may or may not be solved at a later date. Bert definitely feels the loss of his parents, but I can't decide whether he's accepted their loss or will try to search for them at some point. What I have decided is that as a child, Bert spent most of his time trying to find his place in the swamp by mimicking the creatures around him. I'll introduce the characters in future videos, but whenever I made a swamp creature, I made sure to include elements of Bert in their appearances, like the fins and like this tail. It was a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario of which came first. For now, what's important is that most of Bert's features have come from different species he tried to fit in with. He spent most of his formative years travelling around the swamp, searching for a home, and he took what he could from the other swamp dwellers in terms of looks and knowledge. Eventually, after a lot of failed attempts to integrate himself, and a lot more failed attempts at fully changing his appearance, he gave up. He realised he had managed to glean what knowledge he needed to survive and had taken on useful characteristics from other creatures. He couldn't remember his original shape, but he also didn't miss it. He'd given himself the tools he needed to survive, so he struck out on his own to find his own territory to call home. Now, this might sound like a really sad tale, but Bert survived. I like to think of it more as someone who learns to be self-sufficient. He thinks he needs his family and others in order to live, but what he really needed was the space to find what worked for him. And he has made a lot of connections in the swamp, which I think will be really helpful when I come to explore his story more. I suppose I should sum up what we actually know about Bert, because I've realised as I was talking through his backstory that there's a lot that's all up in the air and still being developed for him. We know that he is a shapeshifter and he has become a kind of swamp monster, and he became this monster because he never really learned the limitations of his skill. So he became this strange amalgamation of creatures that he met through his life. I also know where we have left Bert. After years of trying to find his place in the swamp, he basically goes off on his own and finds his own home, and that is where I've left his story. He is at peace, and he's just chilling until I can come back to him. Once I've added a few more creatures to the swamp and made it a little bit more cohesive with an ecosystem of its own, Bert's story will continue. I actually think by continuing Bert's story, I can fill out the swamp a bit more. I think there is a lot that Bert can offer as a character, and there are so many different directions that his story could go in. I could explore his connections a little bit more. I think a story of Bert trying to find a home would be an excellent kids' book, or a great collection of short stories. Or I could turn it into something a little bit more sinister and be more of a mystery where he has to find out what happened to his parents and why he was abandoned. There might even be opportunities for more of an origin story centered around Bert's family, and then Bert's life afterwards could be a sequel. There are so many ways and so many different directions that I could take this story, and my brain is bursting with ideas, but I don't have the time to focus completely on Bert at the minute because I've got so many other things in the forest going on. But it will happen. It will. Thankfully, I have a lot of drawings of Bert that I need to finish, and I always think better whilst I'm drawing the characters and scenes. I think it's easier for me to focus on the story when I'm already in that creative headspace. One thing is for certain, I will be coming back to Bert, and I will be making sure that his tail is fitting for him as a character. He was the first creature I made in the forest, and call me sentimental, but I feel like I have to do his tail and I have to do it well. I just want to make sure that I do him justice. That's why I'm not focusing on him at the minute. Remember, if you would like to see more of Bert, because there is more coming, and the other creatures that I have coming in this series, then hit those like and subscribe buttons, and I will see you in the next video.